Thanks for coming. This is sipping from the CVE Firehose, prioritizing emerging threats for real-world impact. So a little bit about me. My name's Nate Robb. Graduated from ASU, degree in computer information systems. First job out of college was doing IT audit at the Auditor General of Arizona, doing kind of compliance and some security auditing of like state agencies. And so that was kind of my first exposure to offensive security and pen testing. It was just kind of a small sliver of what I did for the state, and kind of decided that that's what I wanted to pursue full time. Pivoted from there to a small consultancy doing pen testing for private sector and federal. And then at that time kind of started dabbling in bug bounty, hacking on platforms like BugCrowd, HackerOne, Synac. Actually got laid off from that job and then did bug bounty full time for like a year. And I saw that Bishop Fox was kind of starting up a new service. They had a job posting that kind of aligned with my skill set. So I applied and got the job a little over 5 years ago. And so kind of initially started on the adversarial operations group, doing kind of like hands-on keyboard hacking, continuous pen testing stuff. And then a little over 2 years ago, transferred to the threat enablement and analysis team, where we kind of focus on emerging threats. So here is our agenda for today. First, we're going to kind of go through our definition of what an emerging threat is and our workflow for these. Going to talk a little bit about CVSS scoring, kind of within the context of emerging threats. We're going to talk about some attributes we use to throw out like newly disclosed vulnerabilities that we don't think can really turn into an emerging threat, and then some attributes we use to kind of prioritize and we think are, likely candidates for emerging threats. And then we'll take that kind of workflow that we've shown and kind of apply them to real-world CVEs, one that's kind of overhyped, doesn't really have real-world impact, and then one that it kind of absolutely does, is worth the hype and kind of does have real-world impact. No, you're good. I think that's just the template. So yeah, just to give you a little background on kind of our perspective and our day-to-day. So we support Cosmos Attack Surface Management, or CASM. It's basically Bishop Fox's ASM tool that also does like continuous pen testing. And so we're basically, what the service does is it's constantly identifying exposures, vulnerabilities, security issues on customers' internet-facing assets. And so once something is identified, it's kind of passed off to the adversarial operations team to kind of chase it down, validate it, do an impact analysis, and report it out. So within kind of the context of emerging threats, the platform does like what you would expect it to do from like a vuln scanning perspective. It's like, obviously there's some secret sauce in there, but for the most part, it's a lot of like stuff that's in public domain, things you'll see in like Metasploit, Exploit DB, the nuclei templates repo, stuff like that. But obviously newly disclosed vulnerabilities are kind of like a different animal. So there's kind of a lot of overhead. So like a newly disclosed vulnerability comes out, and you've got to kind of look at what it impacts, how common is the software, is there a POC out? So there's like all kinds of like overhead and stuff that you have to do to kind of identify impact and exploitability before it's potentially weaponized. So most security teams don't really have the cycles to do this, chasing down every CVE that pops up in the news or what have you. So our customers kind of rely on us to do the heavy lifting there. So we identified pretty early on that this whole workflow of kind of digging into newly disclosed vulnerabilities and determining that impact required an accelerated pace. So high-profile CVEs, generally things move pretty quickly. So if we're like behind and playing catch-up, that's going to be an issue, and it's going to take us longer to get notifications out and kind of identify who's impacted. So earlier the better when it comes to like identifying a potential emerging threat. But given the kind of sheer number of emerging threats that come out or newly disclosed vulnerabilities that come out every year, there were 40,000 CVEs disclosed in 2024 and 2025. So kind of we found that really any strategy we could use to throw out what we don't care about and kind of elevate what we do and kind of distill that down could really help improve our reaction time. So out of this need, several years ago, the threat enablement analysis team was formed. Our team is basically tasked with exactly that, monitoring newly disclosed CVEs. We kind of throw out what we think isn't an emerging threat or isn't emerging threat worthy, and then kind of identify emerging threat potential. And then when we identify hosts or customers' internet-facing assets that are affected, we coordinate with adversarial operations to kind of do that impact analysis, that validation, and then report out any of the affected assets. So really overall, since we've moved this process under the T team, it's definitely increased speed and efficiency quite a bit. And then we're kind of the subject matter experts when it comes to newly disclosed vulnerabilities. So customers reach out with questions about a newly disclosed vulnerability that's like trending in the news. Generally, we have some idea about it, or we've already kicked off workflows to kind of understand how it works. So emerging threats can get pretty wild sometimes. When there's like a log4j or React2 shell situation popping off, it's important that we have this like planned repeatable process so cooler heads prevail during the hair on fire type situations. So just to give a little bit of background, I'm sure this is familiar to most people, but I figured since it was such a big part of the talk that I would kind of cover CVE and CVSS from a high level. CVE is common vulnerabilities and exposures. It's basically just a global ID system for software vulnerabilities. It doesn't score or prioritize or fix anything. It just gives a unique number so everybody's talking about the same thing. So it was created in 1999. Before that, like vendors, researchers, and tools, they would all use different names when talking about vulnerabilities. And so that made like any type of coordination, patching, really confusing and chaotic. So the CVE system is operated by MITRE, a nonprofit funded by the government, and MITRE coordinates and assigns IDs through a network of trusted partners called CVE numbering authorities. There's hundreds of these. There are a lot of big companies. Some include like Microsoft and Google. So the CVE process follows that vulnerabilities are reported via researchers and vendors or users through a CNA, which is like that kind of gateway into the CVE system. The CNA validates that the issue is legitimate, isn't a duplicate, and then a CVE ID is kind of reserved for internal coordination. And then the CNA adds some additional information like versions and products affected. During public disclosure, the CVE is then kind of published to that public list that everybody has access to. NIST enriches the CVE with CVSS scores for kind of prioritization and severity, and then some additional information is added. Also, there's some exploitation and threat intelligence information that's kind of like added after the fact. So if there's if any of the CVs are seen like exploited in the wild, there's the CISA known exploited vulnerability list, which they'll add it to that list. And then there's the EPSS score, which kind of reflects real world exploitation, which I'll cover a little in shortly. So the common vulnerability scoring system is basically like how these CVEs are rated, right? How important are they? So I won't go into all the metrics, but the base score metrics are the exploitability or the how. So this is like the attack vector. Is it remote or local? The complexity, is it, super, is it like, could a script kiddie do it, or is it super complex? Is authentication required? And then is user interaction required, or is it a zero-click vulnerability? There's the scope or the reach. So does it just affect that particular vulnerable component, or can you pivot to other things? And then the big one is the impact or damage. So confidentiality, can you steal data? Can you modify or delete data? Or can you crash the system or prevent access to it? So in 2025, there were about 44,000 CVEs publicly disclosed, give or take. Of those, we determined that based on CVSS metrics, that 80% of those didn't fit the profile of CVEs that are weaponized for mass exploitation. So in other words, these are non-scalable attacks. And so that leaves us with a little over 8,800 or 20% that have that mass exploitation potential. And then if we filter that down even further to just CVEs seen exploited in the wild, based on CISA and like a subset that fit our profile, there's 68 of the 44,000, or 0.15% of the total CVEs for 2025. So kind of our goal with the emerging threat process is identifying those vulnerabilities with potential for mass exploitation, kicking off our workflows to kind of get ahead of those before they're actually weaponized for exploitation in the wild. But how do you do that when this is what your advisory feed looks like? So this is a screenshot of a Slack integration from a couple years ago. We basically ingested any CVs that were publicly disclosed. So this was like we went to bed and then got up the next morning, and like this is what we were looking at in terms of newly disclosed CVEs. So the way we do that is we filter it down, okay? So this is like what we care about. So within kind of the context of CVSS scoring and attributes, this is where we start. So we're interested in high and critical vulnerabilities. So basically any CVE with a CVSS score of greater than or equal to 7, and that usually falls into 3 categories. It's gonna be remote code execution, so you're like gaining remote access to a server. Privileged access, so this is going to be like an auth bypass where you get admin rights or maybe some sort of chained exploitation, and then significant information disclosure. So this is going to be access to information that allows you to pivot somewhere. So some mass exploitation vectors that we typically see of CVEs exploited in the wild are CVEs that don't require authentication, CVEs that are remote, so they're not going to be local privilege escalation vulnerabilities, and CVs where user interaction is not required. So when we are prioritizing emerging threats, we use this tiered prioritization system. Tier 1 is going to be a critical threat. So this is like imminent impact to attack surfaces. An example would be like an RCE in a super popular VPN appliance used by most organizations. Tier 2 is a probable threat. So this is going to be like a potential impact to attack surfaces. So there might be some mitigating factors that kind of lower likelihood. It might be less common software. There might be like non-default configurations required for exploitation. And then tier 3 is going to be low threat. So that's like software that isn't going to be on anybody's attack surface. So from a high level, this is what our emerging threat timeline looks like. So the advisory is published. We use a combination of advisory feeds. We have some LLM magic we use to filter. We look at trending news, and we use all these different things to kind of parse through newly disclosed CVEs. So when we identify that there's a CVE that meets our criteria, we have kind of a discussion among the team on Slack, and then a case is generated to kick off workflows. So first, it comes to fingerprinting. So we want to identify like how many customers are basically affected by this CVE, right? So ideally, we'll already have a fingerprint for the software, but if not, we create one. And a fingerprint can be like various things, right? It could be just you're identifying software lives on a host or an application. It could be something more complex, like we're downloading firmware images and categorizing them by version number, and we can tie that to some indicator on the deployed web application, and then kind of everywhere in between. So next, we'll do scanning. And so that's going to be we have some distributed scan tooling we use to perform ad hoc scans of assets. kind of at scale to identify which hosts are affected. And then when it comes to exploit development, this usually occurs kind of in parallel to our ET process. Shout out to our Team X, which is our internal exploit dev team. They leverage various tools, techniques like reverse engineering and patch diffing, things like that, to aid in fingerprinting and exploitation. So if an internal POC is developed or a public POC is released, basically the exploitation steps are kind of documented, and then we support adversarial operations through kind of exploitation of identified assets. And so they kind of carry out exploitation and then handle notifications, findings, reporting. So next we'll talk about CVSS a little bit. So CVSS can be useful, but it definitely has its shortcomings that we have to kind of adjust for. I think plenty of us have been here. You know, you're looking at a CVSS score for a CVE, it's 9.8, and then you kind of dig into the real world impact, and it's a little more complicated. So Daniel Stenberg is the founder and the lead developer of curl, and he's been pretty vocal with his criticisms of the CVE process and CVSS scoring. Here is a quote from him. So he says, CVSS is a shitty system. The CVSS score leaves out several very important factors that, like how widespread the affected platform is, how common the affected configuration is, and yet it is still very subjective. So I think this is a little harsh, but I do agree CVSS does have its shortcomings, and I kind of picked this quote because it calls out really exactly where we found CVSS to fall short with ET prioritization. So in honor of Daniel and his frustration with CVSS scoring, I'm going to show a couple of vulnerabilities reported to the curl project that kind of demonstrate issues with CVSS. So I'm sure most know what curl is, but if you don't, it's basically just a command line tool for visiting web applications or web servers. There's also a library, so it can be like integrated into software that needs to touch web services. So this vulnerability, it involves the retry delay flag, basically tells curl how long to wait before retrying after a failed connection. So someone figured out that if you set the retry delay flag to 584 billion years, that a bug in curl makes it a negative number and it retries immediately, instead of waiting for the death of the universe, right? So the security impact here, I don't know. I mean, you can't really accidentally trigger this. You got to submit this ridiculous value. This was originally given a CVSS score of 9.8, which seems high. It was eventually downgraded to a 3.3, but this is kind of an example where CVSS sometimes gets it wrong, or the impact might be a little exaggerated. So the next vulnerability we'll talk about is a denial of service in curl. So when you use some kind of edge case functionality, connecting to niche protocols with a proxy, you can cause a memory corruption vulnerability that basically crashes curl. This was rated a 8.1 CVSS score, likely due to RCE potential. Sometimes memory corruption vulnerabilities lead to RCE. But I don't believe RCE was ever proven. There was never a POC released or anything like that. So given the configuration prerequisites and kind of the edge case usage of the tool, seems a bit inflated. This was a vulnerability we looked at recently as part of our emerging threat process. It was a RCE and HP OneView. Basically, an unauthenticated attacker could achieve RCE via some like malicious API requests. So totally justified CVSS score of 9.8 for the vulnerability type. But when you look at how common the software is, so from an emerging threat perspective, we are interested in software that is going to exist on attack surfaces. And so, you know, you can see via the Shodan search that there were only 10 internet-facing instances of this application, none in the United States. So from an emerging threat perspective, we're not really going to worry about this. And that's something that CVSS does not really capture. And then the last example is a vulnerability chain in free PBX a platform for like managing VoIP phones. This is an auth bypass to RCE. Decent amount of free PBX instances exposed to the internet. I want to say there's like 12,000. But the authentication bypass requires a non-default configuration. So when kind of digging into the details and reading the write-up, the reporters indicate that a web server auth type had to be set. And so super uncommon in deployed configurations. So exploitable instances like deployed in the wilds, like near zero. So that's another thing, like CVSS score here is high, 9.3 and an 8.3 for the vulnerability chain, but it doesn't really take into account that this non-default configuration requirement. So it's really not going to be exploitable in real world scenarios. So to kind of reiterate, CVSS can get us part of the way there, but it needs some supplementation, right? So there's that. First is the security impact sniff test. So kind of like, given our technical analysis, is the security impact reasonable, right? Generally, if it's a high-profile CVE, there is published research from reputable companies that helps kind of validate the security impact. But in the past, we've also seen like bug bounty guys who write Medium articles with kind of like misleading security impact. Another thing we see often is like AI slop. So it's just like a company trying to kind of generate content, and it's like a technical analysis of a CVE, and you start reading it and it doesn't make any sense. So just a couple examples of things we've seen. And then identifying how common the software is, and then making that distinction between common software and common internet exposed software. Obviously, for our purposes, within the context of emerging threats, we're not really interested in internal network services. And then last is that the default configuration exploitable. So generally, emerging threats are going to be exploitable via like out-of-the-box configurations. If there are non-default configurations required for exploitation, kind of looking at how common those are. And so I think it's worth giving a mention to EPSS. So EPSS is the exploit prediction scoring system. So it basically takes a bunch of real world signals, like public POCs, chatter on Twitter, blog posts, things like that, and kind of spits out this probability that a CV is going to be exploited in the next 30 days. So you'd think this would be like perfect for our use case, considering we're looking at emerging threats. We want to determine exploitability. But the issue here is the number's generally pretty low in the beginning, and it kind of gets more informed as time goes on. So after that first week or first few weeks, more data rolls in, and the number kind of gets more dialed in. So you can see this graph here. This is actually a EPSS score over like 2 weeks for pre-auth RCE and smarter mail. And so you can see that it's like near zero those first 7 days, and then a POC drops and it spikes up. So given kind of we're doing our ET workflow in that first few days or week, generally a bit too slow for our purposes. Not to say it's not good data. It's great to have this information to kind of retroactively look back on like activity of CVs that we've previously dug into. So next we're going to talk about the attributes we use to filter out that 80% of non-scalable attacks that we don't elevate to emerging threats. So we refer to these internally as nothing burgers. So the nothing burger was originally used by one of our team members to describe a potential ET that had some attributes that disqualified it. Kind of stuck as the go-to reference for calling out these CVs that we don't care about. Disclaimer, so it's not that these aren't important vulnerabilities, it's just like from our risk profile and threat profile, these are things that we don't think are emerging threats. So I searched through our Slack, found a decent amount of examples of us identifying nothing burgers. We've got a Slack emoji and everything. So I figured I'd share that with you guys. So this is us going through the ET triage process and filtering out the noise via nothing burgers. So the first noisy attribute we use to kind of filter out nothing burgers is authentication required. So When a CVE requires an attacker to like have a valid credentials or a session, kind of turns that single step automated like internet scanning campaign into like a multi-stage thing, right? So they've got to do password spraying, brute forcing, they got to get credentials from a leaked database, something like that. Can't really be easily scaled. So maybe they have a foothold on like a handful of organizations, but again, that's just going to be like a reduced target pool as opposed to like unauthenticated vulnerabilities, which impact the entire internet-facing like population of the software. So for these reasons, we CVs that require authentication, not really an imminent threat to the external perimeter is what we find. So the next noisy attribute is user interaction required. So this is unpredictable, has kind of a lower conversion rate to exploitation, whereas zero-click vulnerabilities are much higher. It's harder to automate these, requires a lot of overhead sending emails, links to users, increases complexity, all these different things. A lot of the time you're landing on workstations and laptops as opposed to like servers and edge devices, which are going to be preferable to attackers. Next noisy attribute is denial of service vulnerability. So obviously for attackers, the goal is access here. Generally a denial of service vulnerability is just going to crash or tie up or prevent resources. Isn't something that's going to really further their goals of monetization. Only exception here is memory management bugs like buffer overflows that cause denial of service. Sometimes those can be modified to obtain RCE. I believe there were several cases last year where there was a advisory for a vulnerability. The reporter couldn't really prove impact beyond denial of service, but when the details of the vulnerability got out after the advisory, people got a hold of it, kind of the greater security community, it was turned into RCE. So that's kind of an important caveat is we're only interested in filtering out denial of services without that RCE potential. And then last is going to be local vulnerabilities. So similar to CVs that require authentication, these are generally require initial access or a foothold that's already been obtained. So never going to really be an entry point for access. Generally going to be like local privilege escalation vulnerabilities, like you got a standard user, you're escalating to root or admin. Obviously can't be really exploited from the internet. So after making kind of the necessary exclusions and filtering out that noise, we have some key attributes we use to elevate priority. So we'd like to think that we look like Tom Cruise when we do this work, but we probably look more like Kip from Napoleon Dynamite. So first ET attribute is common in enterprise. So obviously a high prevalence kind of increases the likelihood of exploitation. And then making that distinction between like commonly used and internet facing. So when we're kind of digging into an emerging threat and looking at viability, there's some tools we use to see how common it is on the internet. We'll use like Shodan and Binary Edge. They're really good internet-wide scanning search engines. And then also for like web technology specific detection and analytics, Wappleizer and BuiltWith have some good information. Next emerging threat attribute is those high and critical vulnerabilities that usually fall into those categories of remote code execution, privileged access, and significant information disclosure. So generally a vulnerability type that leads to like a foothold on a system. It's also worth noting that chained CVEs can kind of complicate this issue. So there might be an advisory for like an auth bypass to insecure file upload to RCE. So when you look at the CVEs by themselves, they don't really meet the bar for an emerging threat, but you have to look at them as a whole. So this is kind of a gotcha we've encountered multiple times. Fortunately, when the advisories published, they're kind of grouped together, or like any reporting, they're usually grouped together, so that's helpful. Next emerging threat attribute is exploitation in the wild. So The goal is to have already kicked off workflows when exploitation in the wild begins. We consider ourselves kind of late to the game if this is happening and we haven't started looking at the vulnerability. Some tools we use to kind of gain analytics about this information is CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list. So they're pretty good about kind of confirmed exploitation in the wild. They have high confidence indicators they use of like real world attackers, exploitation and kind of attempted exploitation. And then gray noise is pretty good for like scan specific intelligence. And it's also worth noting that there's generally like different phases or types of scan traffic, and kind of depending on the source, any one or all of these can be kind of considered exploitation in the wild. So it can get kind of confusing, but so there's like fingerprinting. So information about a CVE might drop, but there's no POC. So like threat actors want to identify the software right on the internet. So they're just like identifying that the software is present through scans. And then probing might be like, you're not totally exploiting it, but you're identifying like the vulnerable condition. So you might be able to like induce the vulnerable software to spit out an error. And then obviously exploitation is, getting RCE, you're dropping a web shell, things like that. So the next emerging threat attribute is a public proof of concept. So again, usually we're well along in the ET workflow when a POC drops. We generally monitor several places. We like to look at pull requests for like popular security tools to kind of stay ahead of the game for any like POC data, right? So pull requests generally precede like a merge to the tool by, could be hours, could be days or weeks. So we'll keep an eye on those to kind of get the jump on, POC intelligence. And then obviously Twitter and Blue Sky, everybody's great about kind of sharing information as it drops for trending CVEs. There's a lot of great research as well. Shout out again to our TeamX, our internal exploit dev team, rather. They develop POCs for emerging threats and then publish research based on that to our blog. And then there's always great research from various companies. I listed a few that we kind of look at. They're always publishing like really good technical research that usually aligns with emerging threats that we're looking at. So that last emerging threat attribute is default configuration. So this can really be the difference between all instances of common software being affected and just a handful being affected. We're pretty proactive about kind of getting a really good understanding of the setup and like what's required for exploitation. So generally it'll involve like spinning up a local instance in a lab to understand like everything that's required for setup. And then obviously, like I've already kind of stated, there's that idea of configuration as it relates to internet exposure. So is it like an edge device that's commonly exposed to the internet, or is it like an internal service normally? And then if it is an internal service, how commonly are people basically inadvertently exposing it to the internet? All right, so now we're going to take a look at some examples of CVEs that we've ran through the ET prioritization process. First, we're going to look at an overhyped CVE that had some pretty wild media coverage, but ended up having no real world impact. So in March of last year, a CVE for Apache Tomcat was disclosed. Pretty popular software, has a history of vulnerabilities, so a lot of news sites kind of picked it up and blogs jumped on it. This one made it through the ET noise filter, and so it's just a matter of really looking at the qualifying attributes to see where it should be prioritized. So obviously, Apache Tomcat, extremely common, everybody's heard of it. Quick Shodan search turns up nearly 400,000 instances, so definitely qualifies as common in enterprise. Next, looking at the vulnerability type, this does lead to remote code execution. It has a root cause of path equivalence. This basically just lets an attacker bypass write restrictions and upload a malicious file. A proof of concept was published fairly early on. We began tracking this one in March 11th, and a proof of concept was published to GitHub on the 13th. So this is an example where exploitation in the wild is a little more nuanced and confusing. So many news sources were reporting exploitation in the wild for this one. It was added to the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, but given kind of the prerequisites for exploitation, which I'll talk about in the next slide, we think it's unlikely that it was exploited in the wild on really at any scale. If it was just like very limited, probably isolated instances. So what we were seeing, we weren't able to exploit it anywhere. We didn't see it exploited anywhere. It kind of tracked with what Rapid7 says here. They basically said they were unable to confirm any successful exploitation occurring against real-world production environments, and they assessed that exploitation in this context likely meant unsuccessful exploit attempts. So this is a good example of default configuration kind of ruining that potential for real-world impact or real-world exploitability. So all the stars kind of had to align for this one for you to really exploit it in the real world. So there were some non-default configurations required. There was the default servlet had to be writable. So this meant that like apps had to allow uploads somewhere. Tomcat had to save session data to disk, which is disabled by default. And then you had to have some Java functionality that was basically vulnerable to insecure deserialization. So you could like mass scan for Tomcat versions, maybe even get like arbitrary file write, but getting RCE would really require some manual testing. You'd have to know like app-specific session paths, maybe session naming conventions. And then you'd have to test that custom serialization functionality to get, to find that insecure deserialization. So to kind of summarize, with mapped to our emerging threat attributes, this one was common. It was an RCE. Found it wasn't exploited in the wild. It did have a public POC, but the non-default configuration requirements kind of made this too reliant on edge case configurations. So we determined this to be a tier 3 or a low threat. So now we'll talk about a CVE that kind of the whole process was designed for. So this is a critical impact vulnerability, absolutely worth the hype, kind of checks all the boxes. So in early December of last year, there was an advisory for an RCE in React server components. Our first instincts with this one was it was probably going to be a big deal since RSC is kind of embedded in all these different JavaScript frameworks that are super common on the internet. So looking at how common it is in enterprise. So fingerprinting is a little more difficult for this one because it's JavaScript. So we relied more on built with and Wapalizer to kind of look at analytics. Wapalizer was reporting that React kind of leads the JavaScript market share with 1/3, and it was reporting a little under 2.4 million sites that tracked using React. So definitely fulfills this requirement. Looking at the details of this one, it was a pre-authentication remote code execution, so definitely fulfilled this requirement. For the public POC, there was kind of a lot going on here. So several iterations of detections, POCs, even some WAF bypass techniques as this one kind of developed. Kudos to the asset note guys. They released a React to Shell scanner fairly early on, and it had a safe-based, error-based detection technique, and then they kind of added more to it as it went on. Original report of the vulnerability, Lachlan Davidson, released a POC shortly after. And there was even some like drama between the Vercel CEO and Shubs of Asset Note. Shubs basically publicly demonstrated a Vercel WAF bypass, and the Vercel CEO was kind of pushing back on that, and then he walked it back. It kind of ended with Vercel starting up a bug bounty program that included WAF bypasses, and they ended up paying like over $1 million, I think, to security researchers through that. So kind of a lot going on, a lot of drama and craziness with the proof of concept, but definitely fulfilled this requirement. So next is exploitation in the wild. So yeah, definitely as POC code kind of started showing up online, exploitation ramped up pretty aggressively for this one. The Cloudflare CEO was reporting 14.5 million attempts per hour to exploit this. Google's threat intelligence group was basically reported that Chinese and crypto mining actors were exploiting it. CISA added it to the Kev catalog, and then Gray Noise was kind of reporting all kinds of mass scanning and malware distribution activity. As far as the default configuration requirement, this one definitely only required default RFC behavior. So had to have an unauthenticated RFC flight endpoint, which most frameworks expose this, and it had to be using standard server-side deserialization, which didn't require any like special configuration or developer mistakes. So to kind of summarize, this one was common. It was an RCE, was exploited in the wild, did have a public POC, and was default configuration. So we rated this one a tier 1 or critical threat rating. And that is all I have for you guys. Thank you very much. I don't know if we're going to open up questions. I don't know if there are any questions. Sure.
Why not start from your client's list of their applications that they have, as opposed to starting from sifting down from the field of everything, and just go like, our clients need this, let's start immediately, make that a stop down, and then go to the problem.
Great question. I mean, so that would imply that we have perfect, visualization of all of our clients, applications, which we don't necessarily have. I mean, we have a good amount. I don't know what the numbers are, but so there's often like new products, like CVE comes out for something that is common but not super common, and so we might not have any like fingerprint for it. So if we don't have any visualization of it on our customer's attack surface, then we would miss that, right? So does that answer your question or make sense?
Does that make sense? And you've got it on 72 hours, a very low common thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I'd have to look at that. Yep.
All the time. Like, oh, we don't need to compress it. We're not vulnerable with that license. Like, okay, it's not extracted with all of the product. And the moment someone turns on compression, it's through.
Yeah.
Or do you just say, package? If the micro level, and you're package JSON, or you're field grade, or whatever. Just implement it, and still, we're not.
Yeah, I mean, we generally recommend just patching, but I get the concern from, and frustration from your perspective. We can just be like, hey, it's vulnerable, or, you just patch it, but obviously it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Oh, yep. So you're saying how many like CVEs are just mislabeled with their CVSS score that don't necessarily have Daniel freaking out about it? Yeah, I mean that's a great concern and question, Yeah, and I think the curl project isn't even accepting bugs reports anymore and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, that's definitely a thing. But yeah, I'm sure there's plenty that just go unnoticed because there aren't eyes on them, maybe because they're not like super popular products and things like that. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks.